Good evening and welcome to the third in World Jewish Relief's Globetrotting series. My name is Jean Marks and I'm the chair of World Jewish Relief's Connections Committee. It's lovely to know there are so many of you watching. Connections was founded in the early 90s in response to the Balkan Civil War to support young Jews fleeing from Bosnia and settling in Serbia without any family support. World Jewish Relief responded to this crisis by supplying humanitarian aid, including food and medical supplies, not only to the refugees who settled in Serbia, but also to the local communities. I first visited Belgrade in 1995 with the then executive director of World Jewish Relief, Cheryl Mariner, and my friend Linda Rosenblatt, to meet the refugee community from Bosnia and to assess how best Connections could support their young people. We decided to establish a scholarship program to enable university students to continue their studies and also to play a role in rebuilding Jewish life in these small communities. Over the years, we have expanded the program to other countries and to date have supported over 500 individuals in Serbia, Bosnia, and Poland. In 2015, I was incredibly lucky to travel with Emily Maitlis to Bosnia to celebrate 450 years of Jewish life in that country. Emily needs little introduction. She is the best-known investigative journalist and incisive interviewer in this country. Her interview of a certain royal personage won her global plaudits, and her interviews of countless heavyweights in the worlds of politics and the arts as lead anchor of Newsnight are legendary. World Jewish Relief is privileged to have Emily as its ambassador. She hosts our annual dinners and has traveled to many of the countries where World Jewish Relief runs its projects. I am delighted that Emily has found the time in her hectic schedule to introduce tonight's journey to Bosnia. You will see that she is sitting in her studio at the BBC, where she will be presenting Newsnight later this evening. Thank you, Emily.
My involvement with World Jewish Relief began some 10 years ago when Linda Rosenblatt invited me to join her and members of the Connections Committee on a trip to Moldova. I barely knew where it was on the map, but agreed to join them. And it was there that I really understood how World Jewish Relief was transforming the lives of this Jewish community, a mere remnant of a large, vibrant pre-war community, by providing home care and medical relief to older people, running livelihood programs to help women find work and thereby to break the poverty cycle for their families. And I was so impressed with what I saw that I agreed to become an ambassador for the charity. And a few years later, I visited Georgia with my mum, which was an extraordinary experience. Now, when in 2015, Connections invited me to join them, again, I jumped at the opportunity of travelling, this time to Sarajevo, to mark the 450th anniversary of its Jewish community. This time, I was accompanied by my 12-year-old son Milo, who has a penchant for history and wanted to see the place where Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, heralding, of course, the First World War. I knew these experiences would be so intense. I think I just wanted to share them and talk through everything we saw and learnt together. We covered so much on our whistle-stop tour, and we met the inspirational leaders of this small yet vibrant community, including its president, Jakob Finci, who, as you'll hear later, was at the heart of the non-sectarian humanitarian aid operation during the 4-year-long siege of Sarajevo. I was very moved to visit the Jewish cemetery overlooking the city, which was on the front line during the fighting, and to see Edward Sorota's exhibition of photographs entitled Survival in Sarajevo. We were privileged to have been given a private viewing of one of Bosnia's national treasures in the city's National Museum, the world-famous Sarajevo Haggadah. Seeing this magnificent manuscript brought home so vividly the long, illustrious and miraculous Jewish presence in the Balkans. And of course, I took Milo to the spot where in June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife were shot dead by a Bosnian Serb nationalist. There was a terrible moment, and I recall it quite clearly, when we were standing on the bridge with a guide, and Milo asked where the snack bar was, and I was mortified. I thought he was asking for a Kit Kat or a fizzy drink, and I was about to tell him off, but the guide understood him perfectly, and he knew where the cafe was, where those first shots were fired. She patted him on the back, unlike his stupid mother. So what did we learn more broadly there? Well, truly heartening things, that the survival of the Jews in the Balkans was largely due to the coexistence and tolerance between Muslims, Christians and Jews. Sarajevo was known as the Jerusalem of the Balkans. Sadly, this all came to an end with the rise of nationalism and the Balkan War of the 1990s. We all remember the images in our media of the destruction of the iconic bridge of Mostar, again, that we visited, and that was in November 1993. This was of huge symbolic significance. For over 400 years, the bridge served to connect diverse communities living on opposite sides of the river. By targeting it, a shared cultural heritage and peaceful coexistence were deliberately destroyed. Recognising the historical importance of the bridge, UNESCO established an international committee to rebuild it, and the bridge you see in the photo was reopened in 2004. And on a grey, rainy day, we drove to Mostar, accompanied by Aida Danon-Bavcic, who was forced to flee the city in 1992. Sadly, the bridge was shrouded in cloud, and because of the torrential rain, we took refuge in a nearby cafe. But it was listening to Aida in that cafe that I was able to comprehend what it was like to leave your home, your parents, everything you hold dear in order to embark into an unknown future in a foreign land. It is Aida's story that I think of whenever I see images on our screens or have to report about refugees fleeing their homes in search of a secure future. You'll hear from Aida later this evening, but first it gives me great pleasure to introduce Yechiel Bar-Chaim, who will be bringing the history of the Jews in Bosnia and his own personal experiences to life in his 30-minute presentation. An American citizen who'd settled happily in Jerusalem in 1974, Yechiel was sent to Europe in 1989 by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee to look after Jews coming to Vienna from the then Soviet Union and to supervise aid to Jewish communities in what then constituted the countries of Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia. In 1999, Tunisia was added to his portfolio. During the Balkan War that led to the disintegration of Yugoslavia, Yechiel coordinated JDC's efforts to care for Jewish evacuees from the combat zones and helped organised assistance to civilians all trapped within. In this effort, he cooperated closely with La Benevolencia, the humanitarian aid association of the Sarajevo Jewish community, World Jewish Relief, and many other individuals and organisations. At the time, he was one of very few non-governmental persons going back and forth between the belligerent countries to assure the well-being of some of those most badly affected by the different conflicts. And I'm delighted that he is joining this evening from his home in Prague to share his first-hand experiences. Yechiel will hand over to Aida Danon-Bavcic. Aida's personal story of flight from Mostar in 1992 with her husband and young son remains such a vivid and always relevant one. World Jewish Relief played an incredibly important role, not only in helping her but so many others to escape their life-threatening situation and enable them to come as refugees to the UK. Once settled in London, she joined the Connections Committee, where she's played an important role in supporting students in her old home country. When Aida has finished, you'll have the opportunity of asking questions which you can put in the Q&A function at any time. You can also make a donation to World Jewish Relief using the link in the chat box. Enjoy your evening.
Shalom. I welcome this opportunity to share with you a personal narrative about Jews in Europe, this time in Sarajevo, who between 1992 and 1995 were again caught up in war a half-century after the Holocaust. I am thankful to World Jewish Relief and to my friends and former comrades in arms, Linda Rosenblatt and Jean Marks, for inviting me to deliver this presentation. The story of the Jews of Sarajevo begins with the first major catastrophe to strike Jews in Europe, the expulsion from Spain in 1492. Some of the individuals who feature in today's talk are descended from those Jews who found refuge in the multi-ethnic, multi-confessional Ottoman Empire. They brought with them their faith, their traditions, their distinctive language, Ladino or Judeo-Espanol, their songs, and their customs. One of their most famous treasures is the Sarajevo Haggadah, an illuminated manuscript brought from Spain, heroically preserved during World War II, and now featured at the very center of the Bosnian National Museum. After the territory fell under the control of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1878, the historic Sephardi community of Sarajevo was bolstered by an influx of Ashkenazi Jews who built their own synagogue in the neo-Moorish style so reminiscent of medieval Spain. I am grateful to Almas Bavcic for permitting me to show these photos. The other photos displayed here are courtesy of the noted photographer Edward Sirota, who documented so much of the narrative I am about to tell. Before World War II, Jews constituted as much as 20% of the population of Sarajevo. When our story begins, however, only about 1,000 Jews remained. When war again raised its ugly head, this small remnant community knew how to draw on its own instincts for survival. And Jews elsewhere, almost innately sensitive to danger and experienced in dealing with emergency situations, pitched in to help. Led by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the Joint, and your very own World Jewish Relief. Please wonder with me how such a Jewish community, composed of Holocaust survivors and their offspring, living in the faraway Balkans and backed by thinly staffed international Jewish organizations, was able to elicit such phenomenal support and cooperation to relieve the horrors of war. Chapter 1, Starting Out. In November 1989, the Joint named me as country director for what was still called the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Few people suspected then that Yugoslavia as a country was soon to disintegrate and even disappear through a series of wars that would kill tens of thousands and displace hundreds of thousands, if not millions. Jews are everywhere, the popular saying goes. But could one really say that about the former Yugoslavia? In 1989, in a country numbering more than 23 million inhabitants, only about 6,000 individuals identified themselves publicly as Jews. I started out to meet them, to get the lay of the land, if you will. At first, I visited the capital cities of the main constituent republics, Belgrade for Serbia, Zagreb for Croatia, Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Skopje in what is now called Northern Macedonia, and Ljubljana in Slovenia. Only later would I come to know the Jews living in a myriad of other towns and cities scattered around the Western Balkans. Yugoslavia had been the only socialist country in Eastern Europe to allow the Joint to operate freely ever since World War II. Through its financial help over the years, the Joint had helped to nurture and sustain both the leadership and the infrastructure of these small Jewish communities. Those steps included establishing a Jewish old age home in Zagreb and creating an all-Yugoslav Jewish summer camp on the Adriatic coast, both of which would soon be used for unanticipated purposes. Emergencies call into question what we know about ourselves and about others. To my mind, there is no greater test of personal or national character than the way we behave in a crisis. Or, as the late Scotsman Sean Connery, alias James Bond, put it, there is nothing like a challenge to bring out the best in man. Yet I had no idea at the time that the strength, the resilience, and the resourcefulness of these communities would soon be tested by war. Chapter 2. The war begins. A few months before the conflict started in Bosnia-Herzegovina, I had heard the eminent Hebrew University professor, Shlomo Avineri, tell all who were ready to listen that war was on its way. While the Jewish community in Sarajevo readied itself as best it could, the Joint sent in extra cash, just in case it was needed. That was, I confess, as far as my sense of the situation and my imagination went at the time. I finally learned that war was about to break out, however, when speaking with Ivica Čerešnes, the president of the Sarajevo Jewish community, late on Sunday, April 5th, 1992. The next morning, I left my home in Paris for Zagreb, and from there I phoned to my colleague Eli Eliezri, asking him to join me in facing the unfolding emergency. The very next day, he arrived in Zagreb from Israel. Meanwhile, Ivica, responsible for the safety of his community under conditions of unprecedented danger, refrained from discussing on an open phone line all the considerations weighing on him and his colleagues. In the chaos and perils of those days, he told me that the Jews of Sarajevo would share the same fate as everyone else. That Tuesday afternoon, Eli Eliezri and I huddled in Zagreb in the business offices of Yasha Bienenfeld, a local Jewish leader, to consider what should be done. Under such conditions, it would clearly be extremely dangerous to concentrate people at the Sarajevo airport. We also consulted with Michael Schneider, the executive vice president of the Joint in New York. Our conclusion: there could be no evacuation by air anytime soon. But the fighting in Sarajevo intensified overnight, and on Wednesday morning, Ivica phoned Yasha to say, "Get us out." By us, he meant the most vulnerable members of the community. Eli, who specialized in such matters, went into high gear. Somehow he and Yasha arranged for a Yugoslav plane, then stuck at the Sarajevo airport, to fly the most endangered Jews to Belgrade the next morning. But alas, during the night, the pilot and his plane fled the city. Undaunted, and as surreal as it may seem, with the cooperation of the Jewish Federation in Belgrade, Eli and Yasha proceeded to rent a plane, its pilot, and a crew from the JNA, the Yugoslav Air Force itself. The cost? $17,000 in cash. So on the morning of Friday, April 10th, 1992, in the same week that the war had begun, just when the Yugoslav army was attacking Sarajevo, we arranged for a temporary ceasefire and proceeded to carry out the first evacuation of innocents from that city, using a plane supplied by that very same army. According to Ivica, the specially chartered plane was at first stormed at the airport by the families of Yugoslav army officers trying to escape. When he protested that it was our plane, Ivica found himself threatened at gunpoint by the pilot and co-pilot. Fortunately, an American friend interposed to prevent any bloodshed. Over the phone, Ivica made a solemn promise to the responsible general in Belgrade. Unless additional planes were sent, the general himself would feature prominently in the severely negative, internationally televised reports that would follow. There were other interventions as well. So soon, 2 more JNA planes came and took out all the most vulnerable Jews, their families, and even their non-Jewish friends who had been waiting with them at the airport. I flew into Belgrade as well to see how these evacuees were being housed in local hotels. Later, when the inflow of other refugees led to higher prices for rooms in Belgrade, our people were moved to the Hotel Tamish, Thames, in nearby Pančevo. I assured everyone the joint would cover all the expenses. Afterwards, in a campaign they called Haggadah Bet, the Second Exodus, the Jewish community of Sarajevo, in cooperation with the joint, organized 2 more air evacuations from Sarajevo to Belgrade, one on April 17th and the second on May 2nd, just before the airport was closed down by the fighting. The long siege of Sarajevo, which was to last for 1,425 days, began. Chapter 3, The Ground Game. Then, in September 1992, Ivica Čerešnes and Jaki Finci, the head of La Benevolencia, the humanitarian aid arm of the community, came out of Sarajevo to attend the festive reopening of the Zagreb Jewish Community Building. After being damaged by 2 bombings in 1991, the premises had been freshly renovated. Meeting there with the president of the joint, Mrs. Sylvia Hassenfeld, Michael Schneider, Eli Eliezri, and myself, Ivica and Jaki delivered a striking message. As Jews, we are trusted by all sides in Sarajevo. Even though there are fewer than 1,000 Jews in a city of 340,000 people, if you help us, we can distribute humanitarian aid to all who need it in our city under siege. Mrs. Hassenfeld and Michael Schneider immediately promised that the joint and its partners like WJR would provide all the support required. From this point on, one can distinguish 5 different vectors of activity. 1. Taking people from Sarajevo to safety on the Dalmatian coast by bus. This meant organizing bus convoys to evacuate Bosnian Jews, Muslims, Serbs, and Croats from Sarajevo to Croatia, including those rescued by air. As many as 2,835 persons were brought out to safety, including 1,001 members of the Jewish community. The departures by bus, however, were predicated on 2 conditions. A, to allow the Jewish community convoys to leave Sarajevo for Croatia and pass without incident through the dozens of checkpoints set up all along the way by the opposing forces. It was necessary beforehand to negotiate a temporary halt, a ceasefire in the war, with all 4 sides, the Bosniak government, the Serb and Croat forces, and the UN. Such negotiations were also required if trucks with food and other humanitarian aid were to arrive in Sarajevo intact. In return, La Benevolencia readily promised to help people of every national, ethnic, and religious group. B. It was also essential to conclude a special agreement between the joint and the Croatian government, an accord that would allow the persons we were bringing out to enter Croatia on the promise that none would become a burden on the state. Only then would Croatia open the border with Bosnia-Herzegovina that it had closed early in the war. In practice, that arrangement meant bringing out Bosnian Croats and Muslims on the Jewish convoys under special conditions. In the beginning, at least, all such persons first had to be equipped by the Sarajevo Jewish community with Jewish papers, their family names temporarily changed to Danon or Finci or Atias. These papers were then returned once these guests arrived, because they had given assurances that once in Croatia, they had ways of looking after themselves. Now, you're probably asking yourself, how does anyone negotiate such an exceptional setup so directly and so promptly in the middle of a war? Please do not imagine long and difficult meetings marked by careful deliberations, various political pressures, and detailed discussions as to the ways and means of implementation. Just between us, Yasha used to play tennis with the president of Croatia, Franjo Tuđman, and he was best friends with both the Minister of Defense and the Minister of Interior. Do I need to say more? The second vector, caring for the Jewish evacuees brought out in these convoys, making sure that the people we had rescued were looked after properly, whether in Pančevo near Belgrade or somewhere along the Adriatic coast, was one of my primary responsibilities. In cooperation with the Federation in Belgrade and Edo Tauber, a former partisan during World War II, and then president of the 100-member Jewish community of Split, the Joint made sure these evacuees received decent food, adequate shelter, and professional medical attention when necessary. Elderly Jews were in our care for the duration, but capable persons of working age were encouraged, that is, obliged, to move on as quickly as possible. 3. Developing and coordinating an international philanthropic network to ship humanitarian aid to Sarajevo from the La Benevolencia warehouse financed by the Joint in Split. Early on, I turned to your very own Cheryl Mariner of blessed memory, then the executive director of the Central British Fund, as you were then called. I asked her for additional support. In a matter of days, I was able to report to Joint Headquarters as follows. Cheryl Mariner informed me that CBF will match the Joint dollar for dollar in this relief effort. In addition, CBF is planning to send clothes and shoes for the evacuees to the Federation sometime next week. A part of World Jewish Relief's special effort is illustrated by this appeal sent to the relevant British governmental unit, ODA, Official Development Assistance, by WJR Appeals Director Eli Benson, dated 24 March 1993. Soon, La Benevolencia found itself transporting humanitarian aid from Split to Sarajevo for Catholic charities such as Caritas, the Lutheran World Federation, the Muslim charitable network Merhamet, the Czech Association of Samaritans, Chabad, the European Union of Jewish Students, the Dutch, Belgium, and German Friends of La Benevolencia, the Soros Foundation, Médecins Sans Frontières, and many others. Some especially generous individual donors were also inspired to sponsor their own special shipments. This La Benevolencia supply network became especially important when every side was fighting against everyone else. Serbs against Bosniak Muslims, Bosniaks against Bosnian Croats, and Bosnian Croats against the Serbs. The road barriers multiplied, and humanitarian supplies from one side could not get through the checkpoints of another. During this time, I was told, La Benevolencia became second only to the UN itself in providing relief to Sarajevo. Key to this unusual success was a brand new white truck with a giant blue menorah painted on the side that La Benevolencia had obtained from several donors. Our man on the ground was Vinko Birkic, a Bosnian Croat engineer. He told me the following story. In the blazing heat, a huge line of trucks, some with fresh produce, backed up for days at the Kiseljak checkpoint, separating Bosnian Croat from Bosniak forces just outside Sarajevo. All the vehicles were pulled over to the side of the road, where the exhausted drivers waited with their rotting cargoes. Suddenly, the white truck of La Benevolencia with the giant blue menorah on its side reached the checkpoint and was simply waved on through. Vinko, I asked, We know what people in this part of the world think of Jews. We always get to the front of the line. We have secret knowledge and enjoy mysterious favoritism, perhaps for nefarious reasons. How did the other drivers, suffering there in the heat, react when the Jewish truck just sailed through the checkpoint? They cheered, he told me. 4. Providing humanitarian aid in Sarajevo to all those in need, regardless of ethnic, religious, or national affiliation, through the work of a multi-ethnic team of volunteers organized by La Benevolencia. During lulls in the fighting, the volunteers even delivered these goods door to door when necessary, especially to the frail and elderly. Precisely because this humanitarian assistance benefited everyone, La Benevolencia ended up serving such a wide range of international supporters. 5. In addition, the Sarajevo Jewish community and La Benevolencia provided many other essential services to the besieged city. 3 free pharmacies that distributed up to half the medications needed in Sarajevo. An outpatient medical clinic that also provided home visits where necessary. A communal soup kitchen and communication with the outside world through the use of 3 radio telephones installed in the Jewish communities of Sarajevo, Zagreb, and later Belgrade. The community also set up a unique regular mail service connecting the residents of Sarajevo to their families and friends abroad. Although many, if not most, Jewish children had been sent out by air and land to safety in the first evacuations, other youngsters soon began showing up at the community. So in the fall of 1992, the community opened a special program for children every Sabbath. The youngsters came for 2 to 4 hours to play games, sing, draw, and prepare theatrical performances for the Jewish holidays. Snacks were also on hand, something definitely appreciated in those wartime conditions. Soon the participants asked if their best friends could also attend. So the program ended up, as Yaki Finzi told me later, with 15 Jewish children and 15 best friends. Several other noteworthy actions during the war should also be mentioned. As many as 24 Jewish elderly from Bosnia and Herzegovina were accepted as residents into the Jewish old age home in Zagreb, while the basement of the home was pressed into service as a temporary dormitory for other Bosnian Jews in transit, mostly to Budapest to make Aliyah. Lenka Bilalagic, an especially creative woman of working age from Sarajevo, had no place to go when she came out. And I have a weakness for social enterprise. So Lenka stayed under our auspices, teaching the elderly Jewish evacuees residing in Makarska just how to crochet kippot. The Menorah Club workers earned pocket money, while the Joint and World Jewish Relief were engaged to sell these handcrafted yarmulkes. "Thank you for saving me twice," said one woman. "First you saved my life, and then you saved my dignity." One of my strongest memories from this time goes back to early February 1994, when the last bus convoy traveled from the Jewish community of Sarajevo to safety. This convoy carried nearly 300 people, including a Bosnian Muslim righteous Gentile, Mrs. Zenaba Hardaga, on her way to Israel. Together with her husband Mustafa, Zenaba had sheltered the Cavilio family during the darkest period in Jewish history. Now it was the turn of the Jewish people to pay back this debt by helping the Hardagas in the time of their distress. The president of the Joint, Ambassador Milton Wolfe, greeted Mrs. Hardaga when the convoy arrived in Makarska. Once everyone else had moved on, I addressed the Jews who had arrived after this grueling voyage. They were tired, and emaciated, and clearly their ability to show any emotion whatsoever had been seriously impaired by living for years under siege and bombardment. Sensing, in my own mind at least, the historic significance of the moment, I told them they needn't be afraid anymore. The joint would assure their well-being and safety from now on. Afterwards, however, I had to beat a full retreat, overcome with emotion. Chapter 4: Going Deeper. Only gradually in this chain of events did I come to understand that all of us who had trusted in the sincerity and the integrity of the United Nations and the great powers had been sold a bill of goods. First, we were told that what was important was primarily to care for the innocent victims of the war. Let the bastards on all sides fight it out between themselves, was the not so subliminal message. Then we were manipulated into believing what proved to be the empty pretense of UN safe havens. Cities declared to be off limits to the warring parties, and no military operations originating from them were to be allowed. So the UN Security Council declared. Alas, we know what happened afterwards. It is claimed that the UN failed on both counts. Serb spokesmen claimed that Bosniak military units used this protection to come out from Srebrenica to positions and then return there to safety. When the Serbian forces attacked Srebrenica in July 1995, the Dutch battalion posted there by the UN found itself reduced in size to barely a symbolic presence and hamstrung by orders restricting the circumstances in which the soldiers could open fire, even in self-defense. So the Dutch did nothing to resist the Serb onslaught, and the killing of as many as 8,000 young Bosnian Muslim men ensued. After the massacre, La Benevolencia sent a truckload of humanitarian supplies from Split to Tuzla to help the refugees who had come there from Srebrenica on foot. When it came to their own war with Serbia over Kosovo, however, the powers that be ended up teaching us a much different lesson. To put it bluntly, if you want to stop the killing, you must vanquish the enemy. And to do so, you should use the most expeditious means available, no matter what. Chapter 5. As Hillel the Elder famously said, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me? And if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when?" Fortunately, the war also offered us a much more positive lesson by demonstrating the strength and effectiveness of worldwide Jewish cooperation and the power of intercommunal solidarity to help all those in danger. To illustrate this point, I used to construct a pyramid using walnuts still in their shells. I would then pull away one nut to demonstrate that if you touch a Jew in one place, then another Jew living in New York or London, or anywhere else for that matter, would immediately jump in response. The effect was telling. One Jewish dentist told me as he escaped, "My wife and I were living a perfect life. We both had good jobs, 2 cars, and a country house in the mountains we would go to on the weekends. Suddenly, the war came and we lost it all. Here we are, fleeing for our lives with little more than our children and the clothes we could take with us. And then, just as unexpectedly, you appear. And you say that on behalf of the Joint and World Jewry, you are here to help us. This is not real life. This happens only in fairy tales." Jasna Levenger-Goy now lives in England, but back then she left Sarajevo on a Jewish community convoy together with her very sick father, and then served for a while as my interpreter with the evacuees living in that summer camp on the Adriatic coast. Of that time, Jasna has written, "In this war, the yellow Star of David has been replaced by the menorah. This symbol of Judaism now doesn't mean death. It means salvation." Chapter 6, Closing Remarks. The intensity of those days still haunt. I felt then both the exhilarating responsibility and the daunting challenge of being mostly on my own while facing dire situations. There was hardly any time at all to consult with others or to weigh any given decision for long. Deep in my kishkas, I had to learn what it meant for someone to cry out in desperation. Either you help me now when I need it most, or go to hell. Don't waste my time. That sense of urgency has remained with me to this day. I recommend it to you most highly. So that is my tale. Through accidents of fate, an American innocent finds himself in the midst of a bitter internecine war taking place in the bowels of Europe. Working together with Jewish communities formed by Holocaust survivors and their families, and with many other people too numerous to mention, coming from all faiths, backgrounds, and convictions. He helps create and lead a dynamic, ever-changing program of humanitarian aid that saves lives and ensures safety sans frontières. He comes to feel in his bones the frailty and vulnerability of all that we have and treasure, and derives enormous energy and confidence from the trust placed in him. He is forced to recognize and accept that ever so much might depend on the wisdom and sensitivity he can muster at any given moment. He knows that on behalf of the Joint and World Jewish Relief and their supporters, he has to be able to respond, often immediately, to any and every eventuality. In making this effort, he is simply overwhelmed by the unbounded generosity and voluntary cooperation of friends and strangers alike. I close these remarks with a blessing voiced by a very dear friend, the late Iso Papo, who also played his role in this stirring effort. After the war, back in Sarajevo as he was dying, Iso wished me a soft landing. That is my hope for all of you as well. Hvala lepo. Thank you very much. Now you will hear the legendary singer of Ladino, originally from Sarajevo, Flori Jagoda, singing Adio Querida, a bittersweet love song that became the anthem of the Sarajevo Jewish community, and indeed of all of us during the war.
Tu madre cuando te parió y te quitó el mundo, corazón ella no te dio para amar segundo. Corazón ella no te dio para amar segundo. Adio, adio, querida, no veo la vida, me la marcaste tú.
Good evening. First of all, I would like to thank Yechiel for his emotional and poignant account of the dramatic days of Sarajevo siege and his pivotal role in helping the Jewish community and through them many citizens of Sarajevo. I also wish to say a personal thank you on behalf of all my cousins and friends in Sarajevo who were saved by his extraordinary efforts. I was born in Mostar, the sunniest city in former Yugoslavia, famous for its old bridge and the numerous painters and poets. The Jewish community in Mostar was small but well respected. It was, like the rest of the country, much reduced during the Second World War. My family were lucky to be taken to an Italian concentration camp in Croatia instead of a German one. They managed to escape in 1943 when Italy capitulated. They spent the rest of the war hiding in the mountains. They were hungry and constantly on the run, but they survived. After the liberation, they returned to Mostar by boat, then trucks, and finally on foot. As they approached their house, all neighbors came out to greet them, hugging them and crying with them. By the time I was born, Yugoslavia was in a period of relative stability and economic prosperity. My childhood was very happy. My parents had good careers. We were surrounded by family and friends. I went to Sarajevo to study architecture, and I lived there at the time of the Winter Olympics in 1984. It was a very exciting time. At the beginning of 1992, I was newly married, and my 2-year-old son was a source of great joy and pride. The political situation was tense. However, none of us could imagine what was to come. Slovenia and Croatia had declared independence from Yugoslavia the previous year. In March, Bosnia followed suit, and on the 6th of April, it was recognized as an independent country by the EU. On the same day, the Yugoslav army started the attack on Sarajevo and other cities. In a few months, our world fell apart. Under heavy shelling, we all slept in our neighbor's basement flat because it was the only safe place in the building. I remember once running up to our flat for my son's milk bottle, with the sound of grenades exploding nearby, and thinking, this cannot be happening. This is just a bad dream. But there was no waking from that dream. After a while, my husband and I decided we had to take our son to safety. We left our home with a couple of suitcases and no idea that we would not go back for many years. We managed to reach Croatia and were given refugee accommodation in a beautiful resort on the coast, where 2 years previously we had our first holiday with our son. We spent our days watching the news, hoping that someone, somehow, would stop the horror in Bosnia. My husband was hiding from the military police. If caught, he would have been taken to the front line. By the end of summer, we were told that we would have to leave. but we had nowhere to go. One day, I visited the Jewish community in Split, and I heard that World Jewish Relief offered help to Bosnian Jews. They would pay for our flights to London, and they would support us there. The next day, we decided we would go. My parents came to Croatia to say goodbye. I begged them to come with us, but they still believed we would be able to go back, and they wanted to wait for us in Mostar. So, in September 1992, we arrived in London with our son and those 2 suitcases. To say that we were lost and frightened would be an understatement. We did not know anybody in London, but we had World Jewish Relief, and they looked after us like a loving family. They knew what we would need before we did, and they helped us in every way. They found a free kindergarten place for my son at Hendon Reform Synagogue, where he met his first friends and was able to learn English before school, so that one day he would complete his education with a master's degree at Oxford. They helped us to rent our first flat, and they introduced us to a Jewish Care Employment Resource Center, where the staff used their personal connections to secure interviews for us, which led to our first jobs and started our careers in the UK. But it was a difficult time. There was heavy fighting in Mostar, and I never knew if my parents were still alive. The phone lines were broken, so they sent letters every week to let me know they were fine. One week, they wrote they received a wonderful food parcel from World Jewish Relief and asked me to thank them. In summer 1993, exhausted by fear and painful memories of the previous war, my father had a heart attack. When he recovered, my parents decided to join us in London. By that time, it was almost impossible for Bosnian citizens to come to the UK. Visas were introduced, and they were very difficult to obtain. I was desperate. As always, I asked World Jewish Relief for advice. The executive director, Yechiel Mariner, told me she would be going to Croatia and that my parents should meet her in the capital, Zagreb. They managed to escape Mostar and met Yechiel. She accompanied them to the British embassy, and she somehow managed to get the visas for them. A year after our arrival at Heathrow, we were there to meet my parents. I always think of that day as a turning point in my life. From that day, we started rebuilding our lives. We were able to laugh again. In January 1995, my daughter was born and our family was complete. Like her brother, World Jewish Relief arranged a free kindergarten space for her at Aida Gardens, so that one day she would also gain a master's degree at Oxford. As my family settled, I felt it was time to give something back. Yechiel Mariner had introduced me to Connections Committee. Their work really struck a chord. They were supporting the education of young people in vulnerable Jewish communities through stipends and personal visits. I knew very well how precious education is. It was the most valuable asset I brought with me from Bosnia, and the one that nobody could take away from me. At the time, Connections were supporting Bosnian refugees in Serbia. I thought I might be able to help with my knowledge of the local language, and they invited me to become a member of the committee. They have been my inspiration ever since. Over the years, our stipend program has expanded to Bosnia, where the Jewish community is still facing serious obstacles, and to Poland, where many young people are discovering their Jewish roots. Some of the older students in Bosnia remember the war. The younger ones don't, but they all live with the scars of the war and the devastation it has left in its wake. The country is still divided along nationalist lines. The economy is in a very bad way. The corruption is rife, and the young unemployment is almost 50%. Every family struggles financially, and it is hard to understand sometimes how they make ends meet. And yet, our students are bright and motivated. Their academic achievements are excellent, and they play an active role in the Jewish community. In addition to the invaluable financial support, our program gives them something else equally important. They know they are not alone. They have friends in London whom they can trust and rely on. For me personally, going back to Sarajevo with Connections has been very emotional. Having the opportunity to help the next generation has helped to heal my wounds and turn painful memories into hope for a better future. One of the first Connection stipendees was a medical student from Mostar. He found himself penniless in Belgrade and says that he would have starved without Connections. He is now a successful endocrinologist in California and one of our ardent supporters. He said, "You have not only made my life better, you have made me a better person as well." I can only echo his words. For everything they have done for my family, I will always be grateful to the World Jewish Relief and all their supporters who make their work possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aida. I know we're running rather late, but I think I would love to have get at least a couple of questions in. And I'm happy to say that although Emily has now gone to prepare for Newsnight, Yechiel and Aida still stay with us. Now, Yechiel's friend, Jasna Levinger-Goy, who he mentioned, has sent in a question about anti-Semitism. And if I might proceed just a little bit, Jasna. So she says that overt expressions of anti-Semitism in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in my experience, in the post-Second World War period, often coincide with conflicts in the Middle East. Since 1995, after the Bosnian Civil War, Sarajevo became significantly more Islamicized. So my question is, what is the situation in terms of anti-Semitism, both overt and covert, in Sarajevo now? Now, I wonder maybe, Aida, you might like to answer that first, because you have still friends and family there, and maybe Yechiel can add some comments afterwards.
In my experience, and I believe, Jean, you share that experience having visited Sarajevo with me, many times. There is almost no anti-Semitism in Bosnia. We know that the Jewish community there is one of the very few communities without security. Their doors are always open. I'm not sure why that is. I suppose it is the fact that Jews have lived there for 450 years. And people have lived together, except unfortunate periods when it turned to war. But generally, people have lived together. And apart from the Second World War, Jews were always respected members of the community.
Okay. I was active and going to Sarajevo up until 2007, so I can't speak authoritatively for what the situation is now. But maybe 2 points. One, Jasna has written to me that in the year 2000, there was vandalism in the Jewish cemetery. How unfortunately, that's not a phenomenon that's limited to Bosnia, and it's not necessarily indicative of any larger feelings. What I remember most has to do with this period of time of year, the Passover Seder, because the second Seder in the Jewish community was the occasion for the Jews to invite the leaders of government and the diplomatic corps to come to the community to celebrate the Seder. And I have to say that one of the regulars was the Iranian ambassador. So I'm still left with this very special feeling of Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks all coming together in the framework of La Benevolencia to help everyone in the city, and those feelings of fraternity continuing. Whether they've continued to this day, whether they will guide the next generation, I'm not able to say.
Thank you so much, Yechiel. As much as I'd like to take some more questions, I'm afraid we're running out of time. So thank you to Emily, Yechiel and Aida for giving so generously of your time and describing vividly and movingly the traumatic events which have shaped the lives of the Jewish community in Bosnia. Our student scholarship program has been a great success on two fronts. Firstly, many of our ex-students are now in leadership roles in their Jewish community. Secondly, we have funded additional courses and seminars which have contributed towards the success of our graduates who have managed to find jobs in architecture, dentistry, veterinary science, medicine, and engineering in Bosnia, despite an incredibly challenging economic environment. A number of our graduates have gone on to be successful in Europe and the States. The gift of education remains our guiding principle, and we're delighted that we've inspired a younger group to continue this program. Tragically, the economic and health vulnerabilities of the Jewish community in Bosnia have only been exacerbated by the pandemic. Many of the older members are currently in hospital, and sadly there are very few vaccines, so those who can are traveling to Serbia to get them. The students whom we support are suffering considerable financial and mental hardship, so Connections have added additional funds for COVID relief to each student. In addition, World Jewish Relief has stepped in to give emergency grants for monthly food packages, including hygiene items and PPE for the older, most vulnerable in the community. There was no charge for this event, but any donation you could make to World Jewish Relief would be very welcome and make so much difference to this small yet vibrant Jewish community. You can do so online via our website or by contacting us directly. We look forward to seeing you at the final episode of our Globetrotting series, which will be to Uganda on the 12th of April. Thank you all for joining us, and have a good evening.